Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and the first in our Masters of the Air special series. And what better way to kick off the week than to bring you Donald L. Miller, author, historian, and biographer, whose book formed the basis of much of what was depicted on screen. I've got my copy here. I've had it for a number of years. It's one of those benchmark books about the 8th, and I can't wait to bring in Don now to talk about it. So, good afternoon, Don. How are you today?
Great, thank you. Thank you for having me.
So we want to be clear that we're mostly going to be talking about the real history and the book rather than TV show. But we've got to acknowledge the fact the TV show is out there and doing great guns. So my first question to you is going to be, how did you first hear about Hollywood being interested in turning your book into a TV show?
Well, I had worked with Spielberg and Hanks before, and most recently, before starting Masters, I worked on the Pacific and did a lot of work on that. And we have a long association going back to the beginnings of the World War II Museum in New Orleans. They were our original fundraisers down there, and I'm a presidential counselor. So they knew that I was working on a book on the 8th when I was doing it, but didn't express much interest in it. We talked about it casually. And one day, out of the blue, completely out of the blue, after it'd been out a bit, I got a call from Hanks, and I was coming out of the library with my grandkids, and he said, we want to do a full-fledged series, kind of like a Band of Brothers, on Masters. I was driving my car, and I pulled over, and I said, the kids were in the back. They said, hey, I want to go get some ice cream, and things like that. I said, this is an important guy on the phone. They said, well, we're important too. I said, well, okay. I called him back, and that was it. And we've had a lot of bumps along the road, mostly with COVID, and a little problem with HBO, and finally hooked in with Apple and really got rolling. But we did most of the really seminal work, I would say, on this series, really laying the foundation. How long is it going to be? What's it going to cover? The decision to do the 100th, all those early decisions were done with a guy named John Scheiban. And John's a great guy, did great work. And to this day, I don't know what happened. It's a deep, dark secret, but they took a pass on John after he worked a whole year on the project. And then we brought in John Orloff, and John got very excited about it very quickly. And he's just crazy about the 8th Air Force now. His study looks like a colonel's office, and an air base in England during the war. It's pretty incredible. And then we got rolling. So it started out with Hanks telling us very clearly that he wanted to try to do a cliche-free movie. That was the goal. And the template was going to be Das Boot, a movie like that where men are just going about doing their jobs, where there's no crazy kind of heroics and things like that, and no super Hollywood touch, and no Ambrosian kind of triumphant Americanism. So that was the original idea. And everybody kind of bought into that idea. And veterans, we started talking to veterans right off the bat. We went down to Savannah, and I knew a lot of people at Savannah. I worked there for years, in Bow, along with a lot of other places. But Savannah was a good place to meet. It has a decent archive. They're just actually really undermanned down there, but they've got a lot of stuff. And it was a good place to meet the veterans. And we started out with those veterans interviews. And so that's how it kind of got rolling. Although it didn't really acquire legs in the sense that we were absolutely secure, so-called green-lighted in the Hollywood terms, until about 2000, until about 19. And then we started filming around, 2020.
I mean, it was a long time coming, and that means that there's that level of expectation. The longer people have to wait for something, the more excitement that builds. And I think, we don't want to turn this into talking about Band of Brothers, but Band of Brothers just kind of came out of nowhere. Most people
Yeah.
didn't really know much about it, and it hit everybody. But then the Pacific and now Masters is this big build up, and the more you build something up, the more you're kind of setting yourself up for it not meeting the expectations. But that's a discussion about the TV show. But you said something in that introduction there about the 100th Bomb Group, and the thing about the 8th Air Force is it is an enormous organization that morphs and changes over the sort of 3 or 4 years it was operating. And yet the prologue of your book begins with the 100th Bomb Group. So going back to that writing process, because as I said, we do want to focus on the book, did you kind of realize early on that the 100th Bomb Group was a bit special? And if it was a bit special, what was it about it that's special? I mean, there's a lot, every unit says their unit is special, but was there something unique about the 100th?
Well, they weren't better than any other bomb group. I mean, other bomb groups dropped more tonnage on Germany, penetrated earlier, deeper into Germany than the 100th, took as many fatalities as the 100th. I proposed the 100th originally and I'll get back to the basic core decision to do it in the book, but I proposed it to, I should say, Spielberg and Hanks were taken away by the opening of the book. They like the characters. That's how they're thinking as Hollywood producers. They love that idea, these three musketeers, Crosby and, okay. And so, and the close association of Cleven and Egan, and the fact that they were, there's a continuum there throughout the war, shot down almost the same time, served in the same prison. After the war, Egan becomes best man at Cleven's wedding and things like that. It just, to them, to Spielberg especially, that resonated an awful lot. It didn't with me when I began the research. What started me off with the 100th was meeting Robert Rosie Rosenthal. And I was looking for a topic for a book. I had done a book called The Story of World War II, which started out as a retake of Henry Steele Commander's book. But when I got into it, I realized I didn't really like the book. And so I rewrote the whole thing. So there's no Commander. I don't know why. I had a horrible fight with my, this used to be Top Secret News. It's Simon Schuster, but had a horrible fight with my editors about that, about putting Commander's name on the book. He doesn't really belong on the book. He didn't write anything in that book. And but there it went out there. But there it was, my first book on World War II. And I thought spoiled by that fact. But anyway, I particularly like writing about the 8th Air Force, and because I didn't think it had been done right in my estimation. I write the kind of books, and I graze a lot. I move around a lot. I started in philosophy as an undergraduate. I got a degree and a history degree from Maryland and from Yale in intellectual history. I never taught in my life a World War II course until 2010, 2011. My interest wasn't in that direction. And then all of a sudden it moved in that direction after my father's death. He served in the 8th Air Force during the war, and that helped. But it was the fact that it was a great story, the 8th Air Force. Not the 100th yet. I got it down to the 8th, and I figured, is there a war story that still demands attention? And I thought, there's a lot of books for hobbyists, and there's a lot of books for, the technically oriented, and there's a lot of books that are just shoot 'em ups, and I didn't want to write that kind of book. And I thought this is a pretentious word. I wanted a kind of a holistic study of the 8th Air Force. Ground crews, civilians, those under the bombs, as well as those dropping the bombs, the complete story. And I knew that would be quite a job. And I wanted to do the whole 8th Air Force. I was not thinking of doing one unit. That never entered my mind until, I'm on the fact that I decide on the 8th, and I meet Rosenthal down in Savannah, and we had a long talk. Actually, I walked into the museum and I saw Paul Tibbets, and I had interviewed Paul for my World War II book, for the atomic bomb, of course, and got to be friends with Paul, and great guy, by the way. The And he said he was out by the books, and there was a long line. Nobody else had a line. Paul had a line 3 blocks long, and he said, "What the hell are you doing here?" I said, "Well, I thought you were done with this stuff." I said, "No, I'm thinking of getting into it." He said, "Well, you want to go in and see that guy that's going to talk in 10 minutes. His name's Rosenthal." He said, "I did serve with him, but he was a legend." And he said, "Those guys that flew out of Japan against the Empire had it really rough." He said, I didn't do the fire raids, but I was there. And he said, but it was nothing like Europe. In the brief time I was there, it was nothing like Europe. That was the big leagues. And that deserves a story. And Rosenthal is a great entry into that story. So I went in and I listened to him and talked to him afterwards and visited his home on 2 occasions and came away immensely impressed with his integrity, with his honesty, with his straightforwardness, and with his willingness to share his stories. And mostly with the fact that he wasn't a chest thumper, and he wasn't exaggerating what the 8th Air Force had done during the war. He had a level view of things, a very balanced view of things, and I thought he was just, and there was a great personal story there. I mean, you write books that you want to sell, and I thought he's got a great story. I don't know if a lot of your readers know or your listeners know, but just quickly, I mean, he's a kid from a Jewish family in Flatbush in Brooklyn. Great student, honor student, All-American football player, All-American baseball player. Uh, Graduated first in his class from Brooklyn Law. Um, and then shortly after graduation, Pearl Harbor, and he's in and served with the 100th, got there as a replacement, flew 52 missions, so he re-upped twice. Always said, and this impressed me when I talked to him, everybody thought I was there because I was Jewish. That's why, I wanted another tour. And I did say a couple times that as long as Hitler lives, I'm flying. But it wasn't just Hitler. More importantly, I didn't know much about the Holocaust. I should put it that way. That's what he said. He said he was just a threat to humanity. He was a man who didn't deserve to live, and he was doing a lot of damage in the world. And I like to fly. I thought I could do something. I wanted to serve my country. I had that old-fashioned patriotism, and I went in, and I stayed in. And he said, "I'm glad I did." And he saw it right through to the end. He shot down 3 times, and the last time he was shot down right on the Russian border, taken back to Moscow. Wanted to get back in the war, but it's over by that point. We're into August 45. And he went back to Wall Street to a job he had obtained between graduation and Pearl. And he said, to me, it's the best job in the world, really good law firm and things like that. But he said, I was bored as hell. I couldn't fucking believe how bored I was. And compared to the war, and read about the Nuremberg trials, thought, I'm an attorney and I can help. And on the ship on the way over, I met my future wife. We fell in love. He said, tell you the truth, Don, I didn't know whether I was seasick or whether I was in love. But he said,
Wow.
I bet on the love. And he's only kidding. And they married in Nuremberg. And toward the end of the trials, his wife Phyllis was pregnant, and he had actually witnessed, and he was testified at the trials of all the Nazi bigwigs except Goering, of course, who committed suicide. And he said that was my closure. I was at the hangings, and it was over for me, and that was the end of my war. And I thought, well, this is a great story, and I'm going to focus on that bomb group. And because I met a lot of other guys, he shot me to members of his crew. He told me what reunions to go to, and naturally, the guys he knew. So I came into this book serendipitously. It was the guys Rosie knew that got me started on this. And then I met a guy named Lulovsky, who was with another bomb group, the third, and he had a hell of a story to tell. He was a prisoner of war, and I thought there's that story as well. And there's a prisoner of war group in New Jersey. I went down. They have great records. Nobody was down there. It's down in the Pinelands, out in the middle of nowhere. It's an episode in The Sopranos where they want to kill and bury a guy, and not have no one to find him. But got interested in the prisoners, got interested in the 303rd through a guy named Hank Plum in Texas. Started to connect it together and says, I got a book on the 8th Air Force, not on the 100th, but there's a lot of the 100th in it. You know, when you break the book down, there's 30, 35 pages on the 100th Bomb Group in a 600-page book. But so my book is very different than A Wing and a Prayer, Crosby's great book. Although I got to Crosby just before he passed away. He was in a facility, let's call it a facility. And we did a film called Bombing Germany for the American Experience in Boston. And we got him at a point where he would have flashes. You know how people are on Alzheimer's? They're absolutely clear, for 15 minutes, and then boom, they're in Switzerland and in an internment camp. But did get to interview him, and had a great relationship with Gail Clevin. And Gail was in a pretty bad spot at the end of his life. He didn't have a lot of his people around him. He was sick, and he'd had an illustrious career. PhD in astrophysics and a college president and all that sort of stuff. But he died where he was brought up in the Northwest. But he, like a lot of veterans, I befriended a guy like this when I did the story of World War II named Hap Halloran, who was an airman who was shot down over Tokyo and put in the Tokyo Zoo naked as a specimen of Yankee treachery. And I used to talk to him a lot late at night, and I did the same thing with Clevin, and he was great to talk to. So finding those
jump in there, Don. Sorry, that availability. You said you got to meet Crosby and Clevin there, and Rosie. As with any unit that ends up having a strong veterans connection, or they start meeting up, or they start writing their memoirs, as a historian, as an author, you've got to have that source material. And if there isn't the source material with one particular unit, you're going to look for one where there is. And the 100.
That's exactly it. Couldn't have put it better. I mean, that's exactly it. And as Hanks told me at one point, he said, I was just thinking, we were on set in England filming, and he said, you're the only goddamn guy who's met any of these people. Nobody here, not a single person doing the film has met any of these guys. And so that kind of drew me into the project in a way I didn't expect. Arthur Miller has a line where he says, you know what happens to a good book when you finish it and Hollywood wants it? He said, you walk to the studio, you can't get in the gate, and you throw your script over and they throw a bag of money over to your side. And that's your contribution to the film. But in this one, I was heavily involved with it. But it was the archival work. I'm an archival rat. I'm like Rick Atkinson. We talk about that being archival rats. And when you get into the archive, you learn the real story. I read all 220 volumes, for example, of the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, which everybody dismisses, but which is actually excellent. And It wasn't done by the Air Force. It was done by private businessmen,
Yep.
consultants, et cetera, George Ball, people like that. And you get into into specific volumes just on oil, just on electricity, and why those targets weren't hit. And it's mind-bogglingly good. But what really drew me, you have to have a kind of a hook where you really hook the fish hard. It's like
Yep.
trying to catch a marlin. You got to really lay the hook in because you got to keep your own interest up in the book. And sometimes that's hard because it's really hard to get up some mornings and go down and face that book, especially when Hemingway had a great line. He said, never end a day on a bad note. End the day on a good note. Even if it's 1 o'clock in the afternoon and you're just going to go out and get drunk, do it. But don't go back to that manuscript if you're stuck on something. Because you're going to think, I got to return the next day to a problem. You want to return to something that was pretty good the night before. And that keeps the energy up. But so the hook, that started me was, how did they get in the planes? How did they manage after a horrific mission to climb back into those bombers? Knowing that, I was just talking to Con Crane today, and I mean, Con really did the minutia on this, and 75% absolutely were shot down.
Yeah.
So 77% casualties. So when you stack that up against, like I mentioned, it's almost a cliche now, the Marine Corps taking less than 19,000, you get an idea that the Air Force, the 8th Air Force, not the Air Force, the 8th Air Force takes 27. And as a lot of your viewers know, 27,000. So you got a 1 in 4 chance of surviving. So how do you get back in those planes? And I read manuals, not the kind of thing the lay reader would read, and done by people who had been combat surgeons. There's a guy named Roy Grinker who did a pretty good one, and he's a psychiatrist, not a psychologist. And it's just one case study after the other of breakdown in combat.
Wow.
But equally interesting, one case study after the other of guys who didn't break down. And he's trying to work this out. And he never quite figures it out in a 500-page book, but it's filled with absolutely fascinating material. And he flew with the 8th Air Force. He said, if I'm going to understand these guys and what holds them together or what causes them to crash, not fly, I got to fly with them. And he did. It's a book that very few people read, and it's in my bibliography, Grinker. And it really set me off to such an extent that you get these whims when you're writing a book. Sometimes you get bored with your own shit, and you sometimes want to go on a tangent, but I almost went off on a tangent on psychology and on just this question of holding up in combat. After I interviewed a guy in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and he said that, told me a case study that I hadn't heard before. Actually, it wasn't a case study. He experienced it. He's a lead pilot, and his co-pilot would black out, absolutely black out, as soon as they hit the Dutch border, coming from East Anglia. Every time they went, to such a point where he'd have to punch him to bring him around. And yet he said he was a brave guy. I suggested there's a place called the Central Medical Establishment, and I have a lot of that in my book. They took care of Kate. When the Air Force started to experience, I should say the Army started to experience tremendous rates of combat fatigue in North Africa, they started drafting psychiatrists and using hard persuasion on these guys to get them over to England after a lot of them had been in North Africa. And so those guys got a hold of a number of those guys. They were really interesting to talk to. And quite a few of these guys were actually living around me. My next door neighbor, I was talking to him one day. He was a navigator. I said, how many missions, 56. I said, Jesus
Wow.
Christ, and I'm doing this book, and he never, he knew I was doing a book, and never said a word to me about it. But he was a guy who really explained the difference between British and American bombing. He said, I went into a bar in London and ran into an RAF guy who'd flown a lot of missions. And I think they were rotated out after 20 some, 22 or something like that, and then right back in after a month. But anyway, they started talking, and he said to me, he said, we actually do the same kind of bombing. And my neighbor Paul said, no, we don't. No, we don't. And he gave him the whole spiel about daylight strategic bombing. He said, well, let me tell you, you guys, we area bomb area targets, okay? And you guys area bomb precision targets. He said, that's the difference, Shank.
That's I was wondering where you're going to go with this, and that's a really concise response. And I was going to ask you about the ongoing debates people have, including people watching right now, including myself, about area and precision and the northern bomb site, and is it the best thing since sliced bread, and who was best, which doctrine was better, and they're fascinating discussions, and I enjoy taking part in them myself. But ultimately, you end up people getting entrenched in their views. The defenders of whichever side it is tend to be stuck in there, like we get with Patton and Montgomery or MacArthur and Eisenhower. People don't change their minds. And as you said yourself, Don, ultimately it's what keeps these 21, 22, 23-year-old guys from hoisting themselves up into these long aluminium, as I would say, tubes, and flying off at stupid, ridiculous altitudes into ridiculous amounts of hazards into occupied Europe. I mean, that's the interminable question that can't really be answered.
No. And you're absolutely right. You have to be willing to change your mind. In the book I mentioned, that first book, The Story of World War II, I argued for a one bomb solution, if you will, to the Japanese problem. Second bomb, I took Eisenhower's side, was unnecessary. When I really looked at it closely, and working with guys like Rich Frank, close friend, and talk to Rich every day, I'm convinced that the Allies had to use two. And I said that, and I changed my mind about strategic bombing. I didn't think it worked, and by the end of the book, I did think it worked, but not in the way that people portray it. So
Right.
it's different, It's like morale bombing. Morale bombing. Everyone said, the English had to stiff upper lip and stuff. If you go and look at mass observation, the archive, and which is a fascinating archive that hardly any historian goes into. And I remember sending Atkinson the stuff on the mass observation. We wound up going over there. And you'll see that in the studies they did on Coventry, a smaller city, where the hurt was worse than it was in London, because at least in London the city's spread out, and the hurt was spread out. Morale started. It wasn't shot, but it took a shock. It took a real shock, and I would always say to people, just common sense. I think of the reaction in this country, United States, to 9/11, and just one bombing of two towers. And then think of a city that's hit Cologne maybe 187 times. And you're there the whole time, and your morale's pretty good. You're holding up. Impossible. And it does show in the strategic bombing surveys that German morale was pretty much shot. People stopped going to party meetings.
Yeah.
They became very inward looking. They took care of their families. They took care of the essentials of life. They didn't show up at work on days when there's going to be heavy bombing. Although sometimes that was the safest place to be because they at least had some bomb protection in these cellars. But it's when you start looking at things in a fresh light, and I think me not knowing a lot about the bomber war before I started the book, one advantage of jumping around to different topics like I do in my work, I've done 11 books and most of them are very different things, is you come at it fresh. I started writing a book about Vicksburg, and I ran into an expert on Vicksburg down there, and he said, Millard, you're probably going to write a good book on Vicksburg because you don't know a goddamn thing about it, as far as I can tell. And he said, we're in here doing, the same thing over and over and over again. And maybe you'll come in here with a fresh outlook. And I took, it wasn't a compliment, but it was an observed fact that he's seen. And as a long time, he's an 85-year-old man who had served in the Pacific and lost an arm at Saipan. And Ed Bars is his name. And well known.
Yeah, I met him.
In your racket, Ed's
I met him a couple of times. Amazing guy.
He gave me a tour of the Vicksburg battlefield and stuff. And he was a guy who was full of common sense. And he had that declamatory style that turned a lot of people off, But when you sat him down, he stopped shouting and settled in, and he was amazing. He's amazing on World War II.
Yeah, no, he was a knowledgeable guy. So, bringing it back to the your own work for the book and the fact that you said you tend to go in a bit blindly, but you must have been taken some inspiration from those classic books 20, 30 years before yours. Roger
Absolutely.
Freeman, Gerald Astor. Were there any particular ones that stood out to you as being inspirational, apart from the memoirs of those who were there?
There's a name I haven't heard in a long time, Jerry Astor.
Yeah.
I met him on a cruise for the World War II Museum, and we became buddies after that. And I picked up his anthology, and it's really good. It really is. It's carefully put together. It's not slapped together. And he's a sharp guy, and he picked his spots really well. That was a book that, and John Hersey, who's known for his studies on Hiroshima, John Hersey wrote a fabulous book, a novel on the 8th Air Force that I haven't seen topped, even by Bernie Lay. And so that was another book that really did it for me. And so you find these books, and even books that have been published maybe by a pretty decent commercial press, but they weren't getting read. Nobody was reading Crosby. Of course, Crosby doesn't really talk about the war that much. He talks about himself a lot, and the base, and was a great source for us. But actual combat conditions, he doesn't get into them the way somebody like Lay would in his work. 12 O'Clock High was, for me, for everybody else, very inspirational. My dad used to drag us to the movies, and it only took one drag. We'd go down to the Strand Theater in the little town of Reading, Pennsylvania, where I learned what a marshalling yard was, who told me later. I went to see the Glenn Miller story, and I kept thinking, even as a kid, my dad said, "What do you think of that?" And I said, "I don't know." I was 11 years old, and he said, he didn't have to be there. He didn't see combat, but he didn't have to be there. His life was on the line too in London. And then we went to see 12 O'Clock High. And I said, "Was that real?" He said, "You're damn right that was real."
Wow.
That's the way it was. And don't think it wasn't any different, because it was just the way they got it just right. Even though you don't have a lot of combat shoot 'em up scenes in there. That's a book about psychology.
Absolutely. I mean, that's its main thing, isn't it? And that's why it's talked about in leadership schools to this day.
Exactly.
It is the definitive study of breaking points and leadership, and how being popular and being efficient, and where the overlaps occur in that. It's still, for a film that's 1949 it came out in, it's still amazingly relevant.
It is. I was doing a seminar for a corporate group in Chicago, and in one of the more loosely jointed of the sessions, they asked me, about what my favorite books were on the war. And when I mentioned 12 O'Clock High, about half the class said, "Oh, we took a seminar in that." Yeah. How, when you're in an impossible situation, do you keep morale up in a corporation? How do you keep the guys at the work? Which was what Hanks was getting at too, and in his opening observations to us, which were very impressive. And what impressed us all along, because you say, yeah, maybe that'll happen. I talked to David McCullough a lot, and Dave was a very close friend, wonderful human being, great historian. And I said, what am I going to expect when I go to Hollywood? I'd already had a film, a series made of one of my books on Chicago, and I had a good experience with a guy named Austin Hoyt. I just heard from Austin 2 days ago. He wrote me a cryptic little note. He said, they didn't do justice to your magnificent book. That's all he said. Yeah. But anyway, just a little factoid. I do think they did justice to it, but he didn't. And I'm sure others don't.
Well, let's touch on that. That's the elephant in the room is what you thought of the TV series. And, before going live, we talked about the fact that visually, that portrayal of mass bombing raids with the zipping fighters coming in, the flak bursting and the clouds below, and that with all the best will in the world, no matter how good a writer is, there's only so much you can convey with the written word.
Yeah.
And so what did you when you're seeing those missions it is depicted, what was going through your mind when you first saw them?
Well, I was amazed because, Paul, there was an evolution, and getting held up so much was a benefit because CGI got better by the week.
Yeah.
And it's still getting better. Somebody at the Academy Awards last night, I was half watching it with my wife, said, I think it might have been the host, you realize we're only into the 100th year of movies. Imagine, and we've been painting for 3,000 years. Where are we going to be in 3,000 years with film? And yeah, it's a new art form. But when I watch those CGI guys work, they busted their nut to try to get it good. And it wasn't real good when we started. And I remember taking a flight back from LA and feeling like crap. And I thought, I think we got a great ensemble of actors. The actors were very bright and very into it, unlike any film I'd ever been involved with. But I thought that CGI is a big downer. It just kept getting better. And they're the ones that held us up in the end because it just wasn't right. And we had the maestro there was in this film was not Steven Spielberg. Steven's magnificent, Hanks is magnificent, and Hanks really got the thing rolling. But it was Gary Getzman. He was there every day in England, and he was going to make sure that it was done right, that it was done with fidelity, to such a point that we would lift these guys up on cranes up to 40 to 50, 60 feet high. And they're in these cockpits at that height. And it was scary. And they couldn't come down all day. They had to stay up there 7 hours. It was a pain in the ass to get them up and down. And the thing would shake, and roll and everything else. But it was surrounded by panels. They looked like glass panels. And we filmed through the panels. So the fighters came in. This is what they saw. And it was 4-dimensional. And there was one scene in particular I'm watching, and a Focke-Wulf's coming in to the left, and blows out part of the propeller. Boom, boom, knocks off the tips of the propeller. And the pilot's supposed to feather that propeller immediately. Now, those actors were trained to do that without coaching because they were trained beforehand. Something like that happens. This is the button you press. And they stopped the production to tell the kid who's flying the plane that he pushed the wrong button. No one would have noticed that. No one.
Oh, well, they would, because that's the thing. That's the reaction.
Yeah, you're right.
Is that Facebook, someone, and I still don't know whether this is true or not. Someone said it was the wrong barbed wire for 1943 on the Stalag Luft 3 scenes. It was, the barbed wire was either too early or too late. And I didn't know whether it was real or spoof one, but that's what it's got down to, Don. People picking out the detail of barbed wire.
I believe that. Well, Colleen Atwood, who did, most of the prop work and the wardrobe work was unbelievable. I mean, someone wrote in and said, well, they look too sharp. They look too, well, air guys dress sharp, and they took pride in their looks, and they liked to dress in their pinks and stuff like that. And Colleen had 3 women working for her. It could have been men, but she had 3 helpers working for them. And their job was to soil the uniforms every week in a way they would be soiled by a week of combat operations and just wear and tear. That's how closely she was watching for everything to be perfectly copacetic, perfectly right in terms of accuracy. And we had a lot of flyers there, not just old 8th Air Force veterans, but modern pilots, Air Force pilots, things like that. They spent a lot of money on the expertise. And of course, the ubiquitous Dale Dye was there to beat the hell out of the guys in boot camp and things like that.
Yeah, he's still got it, Dale. He's still he's getting on a bit, but like a lot of us, but he's still
loved him. They loved him. They hated him for an hour and loved him for 2 weeks. And he was terrific. He was terrific. But it got the guys, and he got the guys reading. And actors usually on set don't read, and he told me that they were all reading, and to try to get their parts right, and he hit that old. It wasn't necessarily a patriotic button, but hey, look what these guys went through. You see it here. Do them the honor of trying to at least get close to what they did.
Yeah.
Don't exaggerate it. Don't underestimate it. Don't do this and that. Just get it right. And we've got the information here, and there's plenty of it, and it's accessible to you. So that was really important. And offset, there were a lot of discussions about this sort of thing. Did bombing work and things like that? We couldn't get into that much. There. You want to go to that stuff? I mean, then you go to something very different. What we got in, maybe not enough, I don't know, was the morality of the whole thing. But I kept telling everybody, I've talked to a lot of veterans, there was no morality. In terms of, it was all about what's effective.
Yeah.
In my book, I try to point that out. And all you have to do is take the minutes from one meeting that the air chiefs had right after the bulge. All right, the war's almost over. And I had once asked a veteran, why did you bomb Dresden so close to the end of the war? Pardon my French, this is what he said. How the fuck did I know it was the end of the war?
Yeah, good point. Yeah.
And those kinds of questions, winning. And at this meeting, I'll go back to that meeting of the air chiefs, they were hammering Arthur Harris, Bomber Harris. Not because he was incinerating cities. Yeah, they didn't like that. But what they're really concerned about was it was ineffective. Most of the German industries, as today, were located on the rims of the cities. The center is a historic district and government district and shopping district. And we had found a way finally to make bombing effective by hitting them repeatedly. We just didn't have. Albert Speer in his book says the Americans were foolish. After Regensburg, Schweinfurt, they didn't go back. Well, Spear's full of it because we couldn't go back. We didn't have enough of a force structure to go back. It's only when both sides really build up, Bomber Command and the 8th, and can go in day after day, and you kill them with 1,000 cuts, because you're not going to take an oil mill out in one raid. Places like Leuna and things like that. You need dozens and dozens and dozens of raids. And same thing with hitting marshalling yards. You don't hit Operation Chattanooga Choo Choo. You don't hit trains on the tracks. You hit them in marshalling yards when they're all gathered together. I mean, that was a British idea and it worked. So, if you start to think of it as a common sense thing in this way, it's all an experiment. They didn't know much about anything when they started bombing. They didn't know. I mean, why would they give them those gigantic breakfasts before they went up? And the kind of food they were eating to blow up their stomachs, why, if they knew anything or cared in any way about the airmen, the care and concern was about the machine. And they don't become effective until they start caring about the guys, concomitant with, pouring in lots of planes, lots of pilots. We just overwhelmed them, and especially on the ground, because the Germans had a reputation, obviously, of repairing cities and districts and cities very quickly, because they used highly motivated Hitler Youth. And these kids became heroes in places like Magdeburg. But they couldn't do that toward the end of the war because the raids were incessant. That's how Ulysses Grant won the Civil War, with incessant, in-close fighting. And that's when the South lost the Civil War, when he went across the Rapidan River and hooked it up with Lee and just didn't stop fighting because he could take the casualties and Lee couldn't. But once Hitler Youth couldn't show up, once people couldn't get housing, because they got housing immediately after raids early in the war, and access to soup kitchens and compensation and things like that, all that starts to disappear, and that makes the bombing more effective too. So it was volume, I think, more than anything. Northern Bomb Site helped, but it was volume.
Well, that's one of the things that you cover in your book, because you said earlier about how you kind of keep multiple plates spinning in your books. The men, the doctrine, the strategy, the overarching themes, and I'm thinking of some of those books I read as a teenager. That the War Diary of the 8th by Roger Freeman, that was talking about, and on this date, the 97th took across this many bombers. On the 23rd, it took across this many bombers. And they were fascinating, those books, because it was all that technical data of losses and ratios. But also, sometimes I forgot the fact that it's not the same group. As we found out from the TV show in your book, is that sometimes the losses were so bad. The next time the group took off, as you said, it was 3/4 of the personnel were brand new, and the ones who'd been on the mission. And I think that there's been some criticism of the fact that the series has spent too much time on the ground in the prisoner of war camps, too much time with Bucky and Buck in the prisoner of war camp. But to me, I needed that, because in some of those books before, crews just disappeared and that was it. But they weren't always gone. And even if they were dead, there's still a story to tell about what happened and the next of kin and writing letters home. And I think both the series and your book covered that human aspect very well.
Thank you. It's what made, I try to emphasize that in the book. I mean, that the worst part of the mission was often after the mission, going back to the empty barracks and things like that, and then knowing how many guys had gone down. There's a scene in the film where they sit there and go through the losses one at a time, and it's very, very powerful. As powerful as anything I've seen done on war, even in the Pacific, which I think is the gold standard. But that's That's very true. And funny you mention it, because I was out with a bunch of my buddies the other night, and they all thought the best part of the show was the ground stuff. They said, we didn't know what was going on down there, you know? We didn't know that.
I just watched episode 8 last night, around 7 and 8 last night, and in 8 they were keeping those multiple threads going. There was Crosby missing D-Day. There was what was happening in the Stalag Luft 3. There was what was happening with Rosie, and I found it enthralling that they were keeping you interested in all those things, because there's no way that 9 episodes of just watching B-17s fly into Germany would work. It would
No.
become repetitive after a while, surely.
Yeah, that was one of the first things we talked about at script meetings. This can't be one damn mission after the other, because they're pretty much the same, equally horrific, and make your point. And that ground stuff is really, really important. I mean, getting those guys over there into those planes and flying well, because they continued to be trained in England. And by the run up to D-Day, I mean, the hours that the American and British flyers had logged compared to the kind of hours the new green German pilots were logging, sometimes 10 and 12 hours. It was pathetic. One German I interviewed, a pilot, by the way, down at Maxwell Field, they have incredible archives in Alabama on the German Air Force. Over 100 interviews after the war with German pilots, and they're all down there. They're very, very rarely consulted. That's what I found, to get back to that point of research. Wherever I seem to go, I mean, there's just so much material. When I went to the Library of Congress, I walked in. There's one right on the first floor there, in the building I was in, to the right of the door is a very large room, and it's all Air Force. And there's nobody in there working. I was there for 2 weeks. I saw about 3 people, and I asked the guy who was running the room. He said, well, we hardly get anybody in there. All of Spatz's papers, all of LeMay's papers, all of Doolittle papers, all of Anderson's papers are all there. And it's incredible. We still don't have a good biography. I shouldn't say this, but we still don't have a good biography of Curtis LeMay. It's there. It's there, you know.
Well, that's a good question to move to, is what the legacy of the TV show is going to be, because we all know what Band of Brothers did for the 82nd, 101st, and paratroopers generally in Normandy, and what Saving Private Ryan did, and Pacific renewed interest in Peleliu and Iwo Jima. Obviously, some of the books are getting reprints. Chloe was on to about her grandfather Frank Murphy's Luck of the Draw book a few weeks ago, and so there's and Harry Crosby's book is going to be is already in a new edition there. But what do you think the TV show will bring us in terms of a long-term change in our understanding of the 8th Air Force, if anything?
Well, just a long-term change in bombing operations. I mean, there were 2 sets of victims in the bomber war. There were the people under the bombs and the people in the planes, and percentage of casualties was far higher in the planes. I think it gets people away, and I've done lots of engagements, and then you get a lot of questions and observations, and most people are into observations more than questions these days. But one observation I'm hearing a lot is, I didn't know. I always thought, I put it this way. I always thought, the observation goes, that it was kind of push button warfare. Didn't know they got that close. Didn't know it was almost like arm wrestling. Didn't know the Germans got into the formations that tightly, and didn't know it was that horrible in the planes. And as I say to them, it's not, no combat's worse than another, but what makes this so different is everything happens so suddenly, so quickly, and then it's over quickly, and then you got nothing but a baby blue sky. There's no, battle to go back to. There's no reunion group to return to it, like Bastogne or a thing like that. And maybe one reason that it won't click with some audiences is what you don't see in an Audie Murphy film is one guy wiping out 50, to use the parlance of the times, Japs, or something like that. You really see, in Band of Brothers, you do see in the combat in the Netherlands and things like that, individual guys doing individual things. And in a bomber, it's a collective experience. It's a cooperative experience, much more so even than Band of Brothers. And because you're tethered to the plane. And it's very, very different. And for one person to, if one person doesn't perform his duty, everything's fouled up. So you don't see individual heroics unless it's somebody coming in and saving. But that even happens too fast. So it is harder to. It's less like a Western. And,
Well, we all grew up on those movies, the war movies, where it was always the mission that would bring a swift end to the war. There's always the guy saying, if we get this one, chaps, this will bring an end to the war. And we as historians know that there are almost no stories from World War II of single events that changed the outcome of the war on a sixpence like that. It was always a progressive, as you said there, 1,000 cuts approach to warfare. Very few single events made that pivotal difference to World War II, and yet that was the movies we grew up on.
Yeah, Rosenthal used to tell me that all the time, repeatedly, that, as he'd say, nobody won this war. Lots of buddies won the war, and no service won the war. And this competition between services and things like that is, or even bomb groups, is ridiculous. The bomb group thing is really ridiculous, My book is a homage to the 8th Air Force, not to the 100th Bomb Group. And they took a couple of really bad, well, in 3 raids in particular, they got slammed horribly.
Yeah.
And otherwise, pretty much the same as the other groups they flew with. Every group in that wing, it was a tough wing. They flew a lot of combat there. You go to the 3. Everybody really took a lot, and delivered a lot of hurt, but took a lot of hurt. So,
well, I think that is conveyed in both the series and the book. Is although the narrative can only follow a certain number of crews and a certain number of aircraft, you see that blue sky full of all the rest of the aircraft. So I think everybody is realizing that there's a massive story being told through the eyes of a few. And as we know,
I hope that
only about 4 major characters are represented in all the 9 episodes. It's Crosby, Buck and Bucky, and Rosie. They're the 4 that really link it. There are others who are in quite a few episodes, but considering it's about the 8th Air Force, that's a ridiculously small number of main characters.
It is. It is. 225,000 guys served in the 8th over the course of a long war, and that includes stateside. Yeah. So, it's hard to do that. And when you start to people it, you start to turn it into a Ben-Hur or something like that. As it is, someone told me some criticism was on the web about, oh my God, the web. Well, you can't tell the characters from one another because you got masks on and there's too many of them and you get all disoriented. We're just trying to break you in, and slowly we bleed into this thing, and it gets more and more serious as the war gets more and more serious. The series gets more and more serious. I agree with Hank that it really starts to take off with the Munster mission.
Yeah, but a question for you, Don, in the concept of this is that, I was in Morocco. I went to the fake Rick's Cafe in Casablanca. But when Casablanca came out in late 1942, you might see it at the theater once or twice, but then you wouldn't see it for years. Movies back then were a single event, and you had to have the story given to you in a single event, and then you might not ever see it again at all. But
that's right.
But when you're making something like for Apple, there's the understanding that people will watch it once. They might watch it again the next day. They might watch it again and freeze frame it and pause it. Was that understanding that people view TV differently now take into consideration?
Yes, yes. Spielberg's a really sharp guy on things like that, and trends in movies and things like that. He's made so many kinds of movies, and so many mood movies.
Yeah,
This movie's a lot like Schindler's List. It's the mood that pervades it. Frankly, the smell of death, and
yeah,
it's the old Andy Rooney story that he told me. He said, I think I have it in my book. I left London when I was working for the Stars and Stripes and went up to a base where I had a couple of buddies. And when I entered the base, I passed a volleyball game and I was transfixed because no one was shouting, no one was screaming, no one was saying anything. And I stayed there for an hour. He said it was the most morose and depressing place I'd ever been in my life because these guys were in the dying business and they could count it. I mean, they were told if you get to 13, your odds of surviving are statistically zero.
wow,
So, and the Air Force didn't try to disguise that fact. Even in an early movie like 12 O'Clock High, Gregory Peck tells the boys that, consider yourself dead.
yeah,
That's one of the seminal themes. And that's pretty much true from what I hear from veterans, from my father. That this is what they were told. Um, so again, how do you get in the plane?
yeah, yeah. Well,
Yeah.
we'll finish with a few questions from viewers, if you don't mind. And first is from one of our resident RAF historians, James Jeffries. He's saying, question for Don, there's so much contention with this subject, but what is the most difficult part of writing about the combined bomber offensive?
Just trying to get it right, because there's so many countervailing uh, arguments about it, just the bombing and things like that. Just trying to get the facts right. And for us, doing that's my obligation as an historian, and it's always been my obligation as a historian. But it's a little different with film. All historians, I hope, think that way. But in a movie, and it somewhat comes. I don't want to appear too cryptic here, but at the same time, I don't want to be long-winded. In a movie, you have to have movement. You have to have action. It can't be static. Even a movie is serious about something like the atomic bomb, like Oppenheimer. That movie does have tremendous momentum and tension,
Hmm.
and all the things that are going to a great novel, as well as a great film. And so then you say to yourself, the tough thing is, when do you break away briefly from the movement, if you build it into the film, to the conveyance of some very important information? And how do you get that information across painlessly and even artistically so the reader gets the point and doesn't feel that he's being preached at?
Yeah,
I think that's the hardest thing to do in a book or in a film, because then the book and the film, if it's done like that, gets didactic and preachy, and then it's not trusted. Um, and we know some historians who got themselves in that kind of corner,
mm,
painted themselves into that kind of corner. Um, where to write anything further would be to, uh, in a sense, not be loyal to your readers, and it's not what they have come to expect. But that's a hard thing to do. Like Hanks made that point at the beginning with us and said, I don't want, he said, I don't take this too far, but he said, I don't want this guy dying on the frozen floor of the plane and calling for Marge and the kids. I mean, I'm sure there were scenes like that, but we've seen too many of them. And the action is too fast, too furious. Nobody can hear each other. Nobody's in a seat in the back of the plane. There's equipment flying all over the place.
yeah,
There's piss and fetus and there's the feces and it's just an incredible. It's a whirlpool of damage and people are coming at you. You have your hand on the sucking wound of your best buddy, who's a fellow gunner, and the pilot's calling to you that the co-pilot just had his head blown off, and you've had a little training. Can you get up here and help out here? And you pull your hand off your buddy, sucking wound, and he dies. All those decisions have to be made, whether to parachute out and things very quickly. I don't think ever in the history of warfare so much authority has been placed on people this young. Whether you got to the target or not, um, whether you took the target out, whether you got home, um, it's up to you. It's up to a gang of guys in the plane, all of them probably under 25. And there's no generals in the planes. And there's no radio communication with base. And you can't surround the enemy. You can't outflank the enemy. You have to bull in and right straight into the flak. That must have been unnerving. And that's a hard thing to convey because people don't believe it. Well, that's bullshit. Nobody would do that. Well, they did.
Well, that I mean, that's it, and you know that the physics of being in an aircraft, I don't think has ever been portrayed better. You know, I'm thinking about the
Yeah.
12 o'clock high TV show that followed the movie the next decade. You knew those actors were just sitting on half a cockpit, sitting in a block of wood in some studio in California. You never felt that sense of velocity and speed and G forces. It was just conversations in a. And I think that's what this series has done, as your book had done before that. But a couple more questions for you. One is the ground crews. Has enough focus been on the importance of the ground crews? You know, we've got a couple of the characters in the series there, and your book obviously covers the vital role of the ground crews. But it's hard. You know, how much time do you spend on the ground in a show like Masters?
Yeah. We probably could have done a little more. There were some really great scenes that were cut out because to make room for other equally good scenes. I would have liked to seen some scenes out, the guys living in their tents,
Yeah,
out near the hard stands, and not even participating in the life of the base. They were so isolated. Yet everything depended upon them. And then the pilots actually came to them to check on the condition of the planes and things. They developed relationships. Um, Crosby, I mean, Ken Lemons lived with Crosby and a bunch of Ken Lemon's wife, I should say, lived with the wives of three of the officers who flew with the 100th. That's very, very rare, and that's what you find. It was probably different than the Marine Corps. I was Marine Corps, and a little stricter dichotomies between the officers and even non-commissioned officers and certainly the enlisted men. The crews went to London together. Crew loyalty overwhelmed service stature and position. But yeah, you probably could have done a little bit more with that. There's so much. I petitioned very hard to get the Swiss situation in there. I thought it was one of the most original things I did in the book, how awfully the Swiss treated American airmen who were interned there if they tried to escape. They were shot to kill. And some of them were put in torture camps. That's something a lot of people didn't know about. But it kind of took us off. I had to sit down and was talked out of it. My decision wasn't going to matter anyway, but they gave me, they talked to me about everything. I don't think there was a decision made where somebody wasn't on the phone to me. Did we get this right? It's in your book, but could you explain it? Orloff was amazing. I remember one night we talked for 3 hours. I was down to my beach house and I was sitting on the balcony, maybe 4, just about getting things right, And geez, John knew more about the 100th than I did when I was done. I mean, because he focused exclusively on them, and he had a good researcher, and he did archival work and sent down to Maxwell for all this stuff. That's pretty rare because you're holding up it's costing him money because he had made a reputation for himself with Band of Brothers, doing what I thought were the 2 best episodes, Breakcourt Manor and
agreed.
And he could be somewhere else making another film. He was much in demand, but he was going to stick with this project. It wasn't true with some of the other kids, but certainly with John, and we had that kind of dedication.
And we
By the
should
way,
make it clear.
I thought the kid who played Ken Lemons, the crewman, was really good.
Jude Law's son, yeah, and we should make it clear. John Orloff is with us on Wednesday to give his point of view of his part of this. And I think one of the things with something like Masters, both whether you're writing a book or whether you're doing a TV series, there's always, oh, you could have covered that. I get that all the time. Whenever I finish a stream, afterwards, someone says, but you didn't mention this. You could have mentioned that. You didn't mention Colonel Smith. You didn't mention this guy there. Of course, absolutely, of course. Every time you close any project down, there's always another avenue you can explore. There's always a different angle, a spider's web. But at some point, you've got to say that's it. This is where the line stops.
It is. I had a guy call me last week to complain. And I said, what's the complaint? He said, you didn't tell us who won the war. I said, we're gonna stop right here.
Well, on that note, I think, of course, there is one episode to go, so there might be a twist ending. Does Hitler rise from the dead and somehow vanquish the Allies? But Don, we're going to leave it there. It's always best to leave our audience wanting more. And it's been great talking to you. And it's, for a project that you were effectively writing 20 years ago now, you're still passionate about it. And any final comment you want to make about the book or the series that you feel you haven't said?
No, just believe this, that everybody who worked on that film did their damn hardest to do it right and to get it and to do that as a way of honoring the men who flew and fought. We owed them that to get it right.
Well, that is a perfect way to end it. So, Don, it's been great talking to you again, folks. We've got more shows coming your way this week. Special effects chief, we've got John Orloff with us. We've got Hattie Hearn from the American Museum talking about her historian's point of view. But it's been great talking to you right now, Don Miller. The links to Masters of the Air, the book, are in the description below. You can go out and get that at your local bookstore or wherever you get your books. And I hope sales are going through the roof again for you, Don, with that. And I'll look forward to speaking to you sometime in the future. So it's been great talking to you. Thanks.
Good. I hope I run into you in England at the end of the month.
Yeah, I hope we.
You never know.
Yeah. Cheers, everybody. Thanks for watching. Bye.
Come over the hundreds and see us. Take care.